First of all, it's great to be back here in Pennsylvania with all of you. I appreciate you shortening my bio, Vinny, and thanks for the kind invitation and introduction. But normally it's noted that I was runner-up for Time Person of the Year in 2007. That immediately prompts people to ask, well, who beat you out? And I'm embarrassed to say that it was none other than Vladimir Putin.
His name will come up in our conversation tonight.
It should. He then sanctioned me, personally sanctioned by Putin in 2022 for my support of Ukraine.
Let's talk about, for just a moment, you do have a Pennsylvania connection. Both your wife and your daughter went to Dickinson College, the alma mater of Luke Bernstein. And you have an honorary degree from there.
I have an honorary PhD, indeed. I gave the address at one of the graduations, and so that comes with the duties. But go Red Devils. That's a great college. And my wife and I are proud to have a scholarship in our name, which funds the education each year of either the child of a serving member of the military or an ROTC cadet.
Charlie Rose had a quote talking about you. He said, "The closest person America has to a warrior scholar is General David Petraeus." So congratulations on that.
Well,
but let's
you.
talk, since you brought it up, let's talk about Vladimir Putin. How big of a threat is he? And what is the issue, in your view, between Russia and Ukraine, and how do we get to peace there?
Yeah, first of all, I was asking why I had a sofa all to myself up here, and then I was told, well, you're the warm-up act for Shaquille O'Neal. Look, Vladimir Putin is a huge menace to the world. He has invaded a country, his neighbor, which he denies has the right to exist. He has done it in a particularly brutal manner. The world should not allow him to be rewarded for this, and so we should be doing everything we can together with our European allies, who, thanks to pressure not only from Putin but also from President Trump, are doing a great deal more for their own defense and also to help Ukraine. I was just there again. It was my 7th trip about 3 weeks ago. I felt more hopeful this time than I have for a number of months because of a number of factors. First of all, President Trump, rightly, I think, reached out to Putin, tried to use his personal relationship to bring that terrible war to an end, literally rolled out the red carpet, and Putin responded by sending more drones and more missiles each night into Ukraine than they had since the beginning of the war. Putin has more recently sent drones into Poland and Romanian and now German and Danish airspace. He sent MiGs, manned aircraft, into Estonia. And thankfully, President Trump said, you know, we ought to shoot it down, and we actually should do just that. I think there is an opportunity right now. I was just in Brussels as well. I was also in Paris and Warsaw 3 times. Helsinki, so I've done a lot around Europe and have a reasonable feel for what's going on there. I think that the European countries, which are on the verge of a 19th round of sanctions that will do a lot to punish Russia and those who enable it. Also, they have a $300 billion equivalent of frozen Russian reserves in European banks that they can launder into Euro-clear bonds, just basically give that money to Ukraine, which they don't have to pay back until the Russians pay them reparations, so probably never. That could be a game changer. And I actually think that this is the time where we can enable Ukraine more, especially with that, than if we do sanctions, to stop the Russians cold on the battlefield on the front lines. This is not at all impossible. They're making 3.5 million drones every year right now. They could double that, which would be a game changer. They also have a 3,000-kilometer missile they're about to bring into service, and then help them do better against the drones and missiles each night, and meantime, crush the Russian war economy and those who enable it. This is all actually possible. If this happens, I think you could change the dynamics of the war, not just on the battlefield, but at home in Russia, which is about to run out of money in its National Welfare Fund, and that would finally convince Putin that he cannot afford to continue this war. By the way, Russians have already taken 1.1 million killed and wounded in action, numbers that I can't comprehend, even though for 5 tours, combat tours, probably 7, 8 years. Almost every night as a commander, I was writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers. I actually think all of what I've described is very realistic. It's very doable. We have a package of sanctions in Congress. 84 of 100 senators support it. That is a lot of bipartisanship. And when the conditions are right, the White House will welcome that, I think. And that could finally change the dynamics, lead to real negotiations, and force Putin to stop the war and then to keep it ended for all time, because the conditions would have been changed so that he just wouldn't take a knee and come back at them a few years later.
A lot of people might be surprised when you think Russia against Ukraine, that Russia would immediately crush Ukraine and win. What have we learned about...
That's what Putin thought.
Well, right. And what have we actually learned about Russia's real military capability based on what they've done in Ukraine?
Well, Putin vastly overestimated the capabilities of his forces. They were actually very poorly trained, not all that well equipped, poorly led, terrible campaign plan. And he completely underestimated the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians. They are incredibly determined. Remember, this is a country that was led by somebody, his very first big idea, and a strategic leader first and foremost has to get the big ideas right. His first utterance was, "I don't want to ride," which we offered to take him to Western Ukraine. He said, "I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm staying in Kyiv, my family's going to stay in Kyiv, we're going to defend Kyiv, and we're going to fight for it." And they won the Battle of Kyiv. The Russians had to withdraw. They could not take it. Several other cities as well. They retook some of the ground that the Russians took early on, but it's largely been a very, very bloody stalemate since then. But what you also see coming into play now is the incredible software and hardware engineering of the Ukrainians, the innovativeness, the design. This is the future of warfare, and it looks like nothing that took place in the first year and a half or 2 years. There's no longer combined arms warfare with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and combat engineers and air defense and artillery and mortars and all that the veterans here appreciate very well. They cannot survive on the battlefield because the Ukrainians always have surveillance drones overhead, and the minute there's a movement, the strike drones, the suicide drones come out. By the way, they were getting jammed so much by the Russians, they now spool out fiber optic cable behind them. Again, the innovation is unbelievable. And that's how a country which has less than 1/5 the population of Russia and 1/15 the economy has basically stopped them on the front lines, although there are incremental gains on a daily basis. That is hugely impressive. By the way, we need to learn much more rapidly about the future of warfare that's taking place in Ukraine, and it's not just on the ground. At sea, the Ukrainians really don't have a navy like we would think of. There's no ships. What they have are aerial drones that find the Russian Black Sea Fleet ships and maritime drones that sink them. 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been sunk without a real naval engagement as we would have envisioned it, and the entire Black Sea Fleet is now tied up at port as far from Ukraine as they can possibly get. They're out of the war. And then Ukraine every night is also going into Russian territory. They've now hit well over 30% of the refinery capacity of Russia. Some estimates put it even higher. And they're about to bring in, as I said, this missile, ground-launched cruise missile that will go 3,000 kilometers with 2,000 pounds of of Soviet bomb explosives on the nose. That could also be very significant. So this is transformed warfare, but we have not yet transformed rapidly. I wish that DOGE had been targeted on the military procurement system from day one and blown it up and started over, because there are vested interests in our military industrial congressional complex, as Senator McCain used to refer to them, that want to continue to buy more of what we have right now, the same basing arrangements and the rest. And I understand it, but it is very, very wrong-headed, and we are not transforming rapidly enough.
What do we need to be doing?
First, we actually should have a lot more people out learning about what the Ukrainians are doing. As I said, I've been there 7 different times just since the full-on invasion. Mostly what we have in uniform on the ground are security assistance personnel. They're just basically shepherding the items that we are giving or selling to Ukraine, or now selling to Europeans to give to Ukraine, and making sure it's actually used, that it doesn't go anywhere else. And they're doing quite a good job of this. But we need people in there that are determining what our new doctrine should be. What are the new concepts? It was mentioned, Vinny mentioned kindly, that we developed the counterinsurgency field manual when I was a 3-star back in the States. We had no doctrine prior to that for what we were actually doing out in the field. That changed a lot. That became the intellectual foundation for what we did during the surge in Iraq, which drove violence down by nearly 90%, and then also what we did later on in Afghanistan. That's first and foremost. Again, get the big ideas about the future of warfare right. We just had the Indo-Pacific Command commander in our office. I'm a partner at KKR, one of the largest investment firms in the world, have been there for 12 and a half years. I chair our geopolitical risk at KKR Global Institute. We sat down with him. I asked him, how are we doing developing Hellscape? Hellscape is his publicly announced concept for what the Taiwan Strait should be if the Chinese try to come across it, 110 miles of open water. He said, we're making progress, but it's not at all fast enough. We need to be transforming much more rapidly. We need to transform, very simplistically put, a fair amount of our force from what might be described as a small number of very large platforms, heavily manned, incredibly capable, also very, very expensive and increasingly vulnerable, to a massive number, an almost uncalculable number of unmanned systems under the water, on the surface of the water, in the air, on the ground, in outer space, in cyberspace, the equivalent cognitive space. That is the future of warfare, and hang on to your hats, because increasingly it's not going to be remotely piloted, it's going to be algorithmically driven. They're already doing that in Ukraine as well. If it loses the command and control link, many of the systems now can go autonomous. They find the target they were supposed to look for, and they take it out. That is the future of warfare. We need to keep some of the legacy platforms without question, some of the legacy capabilities, but this is a very different form of war from what we've ever fought before.
You have described the U.S. and China as the world's two great powers. Given our intense trade relationship and strategic competition, how can we prioritize peace and communicate effectively to avoid conflict?
Well, I think we've been trying to do that pretty assiduously for a number of years. Part of the problem is that we had an assumption that proved invalid. We thought that if we invited China into the World Trade Organization, even though they didn't meet all the criteria, that as they got richer, as the trade with them, which was mutually beneficial, unless you're in one of the industries that lost out, to be sure, and we didn't take care of them sufficiently, but that as that happened and they brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, that they would become more open, more transparent, and more like us. And it didn't work out that way. Instead, they are the #1 competitor for the United States. When people ask me what keeps you awake at night, I answer it's all China all the time. And then I also answer that it's a number of threats and challenges around the world that is unprecedented since the end of the Cold War. If you think of the United States and our allies and partners that we need to keep close, even as we encourage them to do more in their respective regions, we're the guys in the circus keeping a number of plates spinning simultaneously. These represent the threats and challenges. The China plate, which is the most important relationship in the world, as you noted, between the U.S. and China and the Western world and China, we have got to make sure that plate doesn't wobble if we can. And I'm glad to see that President Trump will be meeting President Xi on the margins of one of the big global gatherings in a month or two. That's very important. We do not want a situation, as happened when that Chinese spy balloon floated overhead, where the leaders in the Pentagon literally picked up the hotline to Beijing and nobody answered. We've got to have communications. We have to be sure that an incident doesn't spiral into all-out warfare, which would be catastrophic for all involved and the entire global economy.
Are you comfortable the current administration is handling it appropriately?
I am. Again, I have some issues around tariffs that are still hanging fire, and that China is one of those. Uncertainty in the marketplace often leads to hesitation about investment, hesitation by consumers to buy things if they fear that there could be a bit of a downturn. But again, this goes at the pace of the Chinese to a degree. The previous administration had the same problem. They had a disastrous meeting up in Alaska early on, as you may recall. It was captured on camera. and then it took a good bit of time to get communications open again. You need to try to get a floor on the relationship guardrails and so forth to make sure that there is not miscalculation. Above all, what we need to do where we have agency is to ensure that the elements of deterrence are rock solid. There are two elements of deterrence. It's the potential adversary's assessment, perception of your capabilities on the one hand, and as I mentioned, we need to transform those more rapidly, and it's their perception of your willingness to employ those capabilities on the other hand. And we got to be sure that without being needlessly provocative, that there's not a question about that either. And I think President Biden, I'm non-political, by the way. I don't even register to vote. I stopped when I was promoted to 2 stars. I have never restarted. I don't support, endorse, or contribute to candidates, but I will talk to them if they want to talk about more than what I might give to them. And I meet with members of either party on Capitol Hill, which is fairly unique at a time when they won't meet with the opposite party's leaders. So this assessment is not colored by party affiliation. I actually think that President Biden was right when he seemed to slip up and say, of course we'll come to Taiwan's rescue, because he's trying to reinforce in the minds of President Xi that we will actually do that, and that's actually quite important.
Here's some things for the business leaders in the room. You've spoken about the 4 tasks of strategic leadership. Can you walk us through each one and how they played out during your command and how they might apply to leadership in the business world today?
Sure. In fact, in the book that you kindly mentioned, Conflict, in the introduction, we lay out this intellectual construct for strategic leadership. There are 4 tasks indeed, and the first and foremost and far and away most important is to get the big ideas right, to craft the right strategy. You then have to communicate that strategy, not just through the breadth and depth of your entire organization, but to all your partners, your coalition mates, the leadership, say in Iraq, leadership in the U.S., UK, all the other contributing countries, and even to America's mothers and fathers, essentially to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of the endeavor you're privileged to lead. You then have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. That's what we normally think of as leadership. That's the example, energy, initiative, inspiration that the leader provides to the force. It's attracting the best and brightest leaders, hanging on to them as long as you can. It's letting those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the organizational architecture that you develop for the endeavor. No two are alike. It's the metrics that you use, and they have to be absolutely forthright and very, very crunched down and very clear. And then it's how you spend your time. We called it my battle rhythm in Iraq. I had a big butcher block paper that showed what I did with my time on every single day. It's a 7-day-a-week endeavor. What we did several times a week, which included right after all the morning updates, going right out with the unit, going on patrol, so I could live a little bit of what it was that they were living 24 hours a day. Weekly video teleconference with President Bush, by the way, started 7:30 on a Monday morning. Think about that. Anybody here who's worked in Washington knows nothing happens in the White House before 10 a.m. on any day. Monday morning started at 7:30 to show his emphasis on this directly with the ambassador and me and the entire national security team. So that's a very important element of leadership. And then you have to sit down formally with events on your battle rhythm that enable you or force you to perform the 4th task, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas so you can do it again and again and again. It's a constant process. Many of you are business owners, business leaders out here. You'll recognize whether you have this construct or not. That's what you're doing if you're successful. By the way, if you fail at that 4th task, you end up like Kodak. Kodak was the king of film photography and services. They had 2,000 patents on digital photography, but they failed to make that the new big idea early enough. Others got there first, and they have never been able to recapture their old glory. How did it work in Iraq? The surge in Iraq changed the big ideas 180 degrees. You cannot do change that is more than completely reverse what you've been doing. We were failing. The escalation of violence was terrifying. There were 53 dead civilian bodies every 24 hours due to violence in Baghdad alone. We had to provide security, and we could not do it by what we'd been doing, which was clear an area and leave. The enemy came back. The Iraqi forces couldn't hold it. So as we're going back downtown, and I had a series of admonitions. I wrote my own counterinsurgency guidance. Secure and serve the people. We can only do it by living with them. We're going back downtown. We use gated communities, walls, keep the bad guys out after you clear it, biometric ID cards, all kinds of techniques. We also said we're going to promote reconciliation because we cannot kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. And we ultimately reconciled with about 80,000 former Sunni insurgents and 23,000 former Shia militia that had been supported by Iran. But if we judged you to be irreconcilable, pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly. And did we ever with our Special Mission Unit counterterrorism forces, more civil-military integration. But let me put it in terms that you will understand. Netflix. Netflix is a great example of this. Reed Hastings, as their CEO, took them through 4 major incarnations. There's others, he also took them global. But the first one is, the big idea was we're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. So we're going to undercut Blockbuster. Of course, Blockbuster goes out of business. There's one left in the lower 48 states, Bend, Oregon. They refuse to let their Blockbuster die. That's great because people of my generation can take our grandkids there now and show them what we did on a Friday night. The second big idea, he notices during the 4th task that broadband speeds are accelerating greatly. So now the big idea is we're going to download movies, and they do that. The third big idea was the breakout moment. This is we're going to make our own content. $100 million on House of Cards alone, the American version. All the other iconic series that we revisited, especially during the COVID pandemic. And then the final big idea was we're going to make major motion pictures. He goes out, buys not 1, but 2 major movie studios. And 3 years ago, great metric, they had more Academy Award nominations than any other major studio in the world. Now, I did sit down with Reed. He came and spoke to a group of KKR investors one time, and I laid out the intellectual construct I used. He had one very similar, some different nomenclature, but essentially the same. But then I did have to say, Reed, I have to tell you, that movie in which Brad Pitt plays General Stan McChrystal just didn't work. Brad Pitt salutes awkwardly. He marches around stiffly like a toy soldier. He has no sense of humor. This is not the Stan McChrystal with whom I spent 5 years in combat. Beyond that, I said, I could not believe that Brad Pitt did not hold out to play me.
What do you see as the most urgent national security threats facing the United States today?
Well, I think I'd come back to what I stated earlier. It's both all of the threats and challenges that face us, and we do need to help with all of them. Yes, get the Europeans doing more on Ukraine, but look, it's in our cold, hard national interest that the kind of aggression carried out by Russia does not succeed against a country that generally cherishes the same freedoms, economic system, and democratic ideals that we share. Not perfectly by any means, but there's no contest between Russia and Ukraine. We have to be involved in the Middle East without question. We can't pivot to Asia. You can rebalance to Asia, but you can't leave. So it's about how do you do this most effectively, in a sense most economically, while still achieving the outcome that your national interests. Again, we're not doing national charity out there. These are in our cold, hard national interests because the international system that we largely were the architects for in the wake of World War II, we and the other victorious countries, has worked really, really well for the United States. We have all kinds of challenges at home, but let me tell you, our per capita income and the innovation and all the other elements of our national ecosystem are the envy of the rest of the world. But then it really is China. We have to get that right. We have to ensure, first and foremost, that deterrence is rock solid, and then we've got to figure out a relationship so that we can get along together. We cannot decouple from China. You should de-risk, and actually we have, and other firms have, but we are highly dependent on them for a whole host of commodities, strategic minerals, processed minerals, et cetera. We cannot do without them, and they cannot feed their livestock nor their people without us. So we need to recognize that. You better pick that up. That could be important.
It's all good.
It's the White House.
You've held leadership roles both in the military and the CIA. How did your leadership style shift between those roles, and in what ways did it remain consistent?
It's a wonderful question, and you get asked that more and more the more senior you get. Could you describe your leadership style to us, is the question. And I always will answer by saying, if you will tell me the leadership style that will bring out the best in each of my individual direct reports, and also in the organization collectively, I'll tell you the kind of style that I try to portray and to practice. The truth is, it's very, very different being a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader of an airborne in an airborne battalion in Italy, or a rompin' stompin' brigade commander of an airborne regiment in the 82nd Airborne Division, where, you know, it's all lead the way, follow me, do as I do. And as you get further up and you get other elements that enter it, obviously your style has to change. And I think you have to try really hard to appreciate what is it that will bring out the best. And in fact, in the CIA, and I know there's some folks who have spouses or were in the CIA, children, because they came up to me and proudly, and they should be proud. It's an incredible organization. But there are different elements. You have those who are the actual spies that rightly steal secrets, recruit sources, and carry out sometimes clandestine activities. They're almost like special forces in a lot of ways. They respond more to that kind of style. They're very, very bright as well, though. You know, the model for the CIA is a Princeton PhD who can hold his own in a bar fight. I have the Princeton PhD, but, you know, the other piece we're working on. But then we have the analysts, and the analysts are very cerebral. And that's where, frankly, Professor Petraeus could roll that out, and they enjoyed the intellectual back and forth. The science and technology people, they're the gee-whiz folks, and you got to be sufficiently gee-whiz, and on and on. So you get the idea that when people ask you, what is your leadership style, it's not something that should constantly be the same. I mean, I think you should be forthright with people. I think you should truly like people. I think you should act the way that you'd like them to act. The golden rule applies, I think, at all levels of leadership. That doesn't mean that you don't fire people, but I was never somebody who loved a public execution, as they say. I thought it's far better to allow a person to keep his or her dignity intact, and as you move them on to something else if they didn't demonstrate the capabilities that you needed.
Lastly, for the next generation of leaders who are in the room tonight, what qualities would you encourage them to cultivate today?
Well, this is an interesting question as well, because when I came home from my first tour in Iraq, I commanded the great 101st Airborne Division, Screaming Eagles, as we did the fight to Baghdad, and then the longest air assault in history up into Mosul, and spent the first year there. When I came back, I immediately called the commandant of the U.S. Military Academy, and I said, I want to talk to the seniors, the graduating cadets, because we were at a unique moment. We had the war in Afghanistan, now you had a big war in Iraq. For the first time in many, many decades, probably since the height of Vietnam, every cadet is going to lead America's sons and daughters in combat, the greatest responsibility and the greatest privilege imaginable. But the truth is, half of them were too cool for school. And so I was going to go there and give them a dose of cold reality. It stems from a belief, so for next generations, I believe that life is a competitive endeavor, that you don't actually get a trophy just for showing up like little kids soccer. And you actually want to compete to be the best, but as you're doing that, you should compete to be the best team player as well. People don't want to be led by somebody who is proud to be average, who's satisfied with the gentleman's speed. They want to be led, especially in combat, by somebody who's doing everything that he or she can do to be the very best leader absolutely possible, to be the master of the profession in which that person is leading fellow Americans. So I think also that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. The timing might not be right. It could not have been maybe right. I mean, there's no one else that commanded 2 wars in recent decades in modern history. But I'd like to think that I've spent a lifetime preparing for each of those opportunities, and that I certainly tried the very hardest that I could to make the very best of these enormously challenging situations with the help of all those that were standing up here, so many of whom served in Iraq and Afghanistan, other places in the Middle East, Philippines, and so forth during the post-9/11 wars. So I think it's about taking your professional life really seriously, competing to be the best. If you don't make it, congratulate the one who beat you out. Compete to be the best team player as well. And if you embark on that, at the very least, you'll know that you have given everything you have to achieve all that is humanly possible and to truly be all that you can be.
Lastly and quickly, do you prefer Department of Defense or Department of War?
I'm trying to figure out how much the signage and the stationery and all the rest of that are going to calculate. When you give me that number, I might have a more informed view of this particular thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, General David Petraeus, thank you so much.